So, exactly a week ago, the US Embassy here in South Korea wrote a tweet. And it wasn't a political tweet, it was a tweet about how Marvel Comics came up with a new character. And this new character was a Korean superhero. Now, as soon as I saw this, I was really excited and I wanted to see what the superhero looked like. And the hero looked like this. No, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a big fan of that costume design or even that name. Let's start with the name itself, Taegukgi. Now, Taegukgi is actually the name of the South Korean flag itself. It kind of feels a little weird to name a character after the country's flag. It would be like if Captain America was called the Star Spangled Banner. That kind of sounds weird, doesn't it? Why was the character called Taegukgi? Could there have been any other name for the character? Did it have to be a specific Korean name to the point that it had to be the name of the Korean flag? Is he a super hardcore patriot? Is he a walking caricature of a nationalist? Is he one of those right wing protesters that we see in South Korean protests? Who is he? Judging from the name alone, there are so many assumptions that I can make, and none of them really all that great. And then there's a costume. He's not wearing a costume that is based on the Korean flag. He is wearing the Korean flag. You have the red and blue yin yang symbol on his chest. You have the stripes on his right and left shoulders. And each of those symbols have their own unique meanings. I'll link them down below. And there's a picture right next to you if you want to see it. Now you'll notice that he's got the black stripes on his right and left shoulders, but those are only two symbols. Where are the other two symbols? I don't see them in any of the panels that they showed in the website, so I can only imagine that they are either absent or that they are printed somewhere where they shouldn't be. You know, going back to Captain America, imagine if Captain America wasn't called Captain America. Imagine that he was called the Star Spangled Banner, and imagine that he wasn't wearing a costume that was based on the American flag, but was wearing actually the American flag. How ridiculous would that be? Can you imagine it? Well, you don't have to imagine it because back in 1941, DC Comics came up with a character called the Star Spangled Kid and his sidekick called Stripesy. Yeah, ridiculous, isn't it? That's what I see when I see this Taegukgi character. It's just ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm some kind of a huge Marvel Comics fan. I am a fan, but I'm not one of those fans who has read every single issue of every single Marvel comic book. I'm not that kind of guy. But I have been a fan of Marvel Comics even before I read Marvel Comics as a kid. Now, to explain, I have to talk a little bit about when I was around 9 years old. When I was around 9 years old, the only comic books that I'd known before then was just Archie comics. But there was this kid who was older than me. I think he was older than me by 5 or 6 years. And he had a collection of comic books. He had Spider-Man and Wolverine and Spawn comic books. His comic book collection was something that I really wanted to borrow and read. But of course, I was 8 or 9 years old, and he was a teenager who was collecting comic books. He didn't want me to touch his comic books. Understandably, I would have crumpled the pages or smudged the covers or something. So he never let me touch his comic books, but being the kid that I was at the time, I just kept on begging him to lend me his comic books. And so eventually, he came up with a plan to shut me up. And what he did was he gave me the stack of Marvel comic book character cards. Now, I don't know how many of you remember this, but back in the early 1990s, Marvel Comics had a collection of cards with the comic book characters. It was a bit like baseball cards. You know how in baseball cards you see a picture of the baseball player at the front and at the back of the card there's stats? It kind of worked like that, except they were Marvel comic book characters. Now, I still have those cards, and I'm kind of excited to share some of them with you. Now, the first card that I want to share with you is this one. It's the Celestials. Now, the Celestials are going to be a part of the Eternals, I believe, a movie that will be coming out sometime later this year, or maybe next year, I'm not quite sure. And the second card that I want to show you is for the Vision and the Scarlet Witch, or as a lot of people these days know them, as WandaVision. But the card that I want to share with you the most, my favorite card, is this one. It's a character called Sunfire. Now, Sunfire is a character that first appeared in Marvel comic books in 1970. And he was a Japanese character. Now, I have never seen Sunfire in any of the comic books since I was a kid or even until now, and I think he's mostly a largely forgotten character. But even before I had ever laid eyes upon an actual Marvel comic book, I saw this card and I became a fan of Sunfire. And look, I was just a kid at the time. I didn't know what racial representation was. I didn't know that I wanted to see more characters on screen who kind of looked like me, except, taller and better looking and more muscular. But, I didn't know any of that. But as soon as I saw Sunfire, I knew that there was something different about that character. And it's obviously because, unlike most other superheroes at the time, Sunfire was not a Caucasian man. He was Asian. I mean, sure, he's Japanese and he's not Korean, and even at that age, I knew there was a difference between Japanese and Korean, but I was still excited to see an Asian superhero character on the pages, even if I had never actually read a comic book. Now, I've only just recently been informed that this picture of Sunfire does not represent the very first costume that Sunfire actually wore. I was told that the very first costume that Sunfire wore was a lot more wacky and also a lot more problematic, shall we say. But I didn't know that at the time. At the time, this was the only costume that I ever saw Sunfire wear. And the thing about this costume is that it's extremely subtle about its Japanese origins. The only thing about that costume that you could see was Japanese was the samurai shoulder armor. Other than that, it was just a typical superhero costume. And the thing about Sunfire was that his name wasn't a typical Japanese name. His name wasn't, Hinomaru, like Taegukgi's name is. And the reason why I say Hinomaru is that's because Hinomaru is the name of the Japanese flag. The point is that even though I know nothing about Sunfire other than what's written on this little card that I just showed you, Sunfire's name is Sunfire and not Hinomaru or some weird stereotypical Japanese name. And the thing about Sunfire is that his superpower is the ability to fly and to release superheated plasma rays from his hands. He was a superhero who happened to be Japanese. He wasn't a Japanese superhero. Now let's take a look back at that picture of Taegukgi. Now Taegukgi is literally wearing the Korean flag and his name is the Korean flag. And immediately, even without knowing any of his backstory or what even his superpowers are, I'm making assumptions about this character and none of them are that good. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a Korean. I'm a Korean citizen and I served in the Korean army. I love my country and I love my flag. But the problem with the flag is that we have to take into consideration modern day political sensibilities that are going on in Korea. It's a bit like how in America, a lot of alt-right protesters have been carrying the American flag in their protests. Yes, they appropriated the American flag and they kind of made it their symbol. And so even though you're an American citizen, as soon as you see the American flag, there's this tiny little voice in your head that says, ooh, maybe there's some kind of alt-right sort of connection to that symbol now. And that's sort of like what's going on in Korea. Yes, I'm a Korean and I do love my country and my flag, but because that flag has been often used in a lot of far-right protests that have been going on for a long time here in Korea, a lot of the protesters' demands being a little loony, the Korean flag has come to symbolize at least a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling when it comes to politics. Now, Marvel Comics is an American company, and so obviously they created this character, maybe to placate Korean American fans, maybe hopefully to get some actual Korean fans too, and maybe they're looking at it from a strictly American point of view, and they think that, oh, a character's wearing a Korean flag, Korean fans must really gonna be going for it. Now, I can't obviously speak for other Koreans, but when I see this, I'm not that big of a fan. Now, going back to Sunfire, just based on that costume and name and what little information I got from the back of the card, Sunfire doesn't strike me as someone whose identity is based solely on being Japanese. It seems that Sunfire is a superhero who happens to be Japanese. But if you look at Taegukgi, his costume, his name, and what he looks like, it feels as though his entire identity is about being Korean. But what is being Korean? There are 50 million people in South Korea, and each of us is different. Each of us has different political ideologies. Each of us have different visions of what we think it must mean to be Korean. But this guy is wearing literally the Korean flag. What does this guy represent? Does this guy represent Koreans? And if so, what does that even mean? Now, I don't actually know much about Sunfire or Taegukgi, but another comic book character that I do know a little bit more about is Kamala Khan, aka Miss Marvel. Now, Miss Marvel is a relatively new comic book character. I believe she first appeared in 2013 or 2014, and she is a Pakistani teenage girl. But her superhero name is Miss Marvel. It isn't Pakistan, and she's not wearing the Pakistani flag. She is a comic book character who happens to be Pakistani. So obviously, Marvel Comics knows how to make comic book characters that are, subtle. They're not complete caricatures. Now, obviously, we're gonna have to wait and see what Marvel Comics decides to do with Taegukgi. Maybe they're gonna make him a really awesome character. Who knows? Maybe he'll appear in a future MCU movie someday. Again, who knows? But I really wish that they had gone with a different design. Something less in your face and a bit more subtle than what we've got from Taegukgi. That was just disappointing. Anyway, that's the end of this video. If you like this content, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button. And don't forget to click on the notification bell. If you have a comment, leave it down below. I'm John Lay, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.